Our next speaker, and again, we're going to do the opening remarks and then there'll be questions and answers, and I have a number of questions now already, is Mr. Jim Popkin, former senior investigative producer for NBC Nightly News and the founder of Seven Oaks Media Group, where he's now the executive. Before I read his formal bio, we've worked with him for many years, and he did some very, very important breaking news items through Nightly News of Whistleblowers, and always did an extremely credible, effective, and balanced job. And it was just good to know that there were producers who were interested not only in the story, but also in protecting the whistleblower and getting hard and sometimes controversial news out there. Jim worked at several senior positions for NBC News over a 14-year period. He was a senior investigative producer and oversaw a team of correspondents and producers that broke major stories for NBC News on politics, Wall Street scandals, defense intelligence scandals, and law enforcement controversies. He was an on-air correspondent, and his stories appeared on NBC Today's Show, The Weekend Nightly News, CNBC, MSNBC. Mr. Popkin has won 4 National Emmy Awards for Outstanding Journalism, 2 Edward Murrow Awards, and was a finalist for the National Magazine Award. The American Journalism Review profiled him as one of Washington's most enterprising journalists. He is now, as I said, the founder of a media consulting group known as Seven Oaks Media Group. And it's my honor to have Jim here, and I'm looking forward to his remarks.
Thank you, Steve. Despite Steve's kind words today, I thought I'd be a little contrarian in talking about whistleblowers. In preparing for today, I was thinking back. I was a journalist for 25 years, about 25 years, and during that time, I probably produced or reported on a couple of dozen stories that involved whistleblowers. But in the same period, I interviewed and talked to and ultimately declined to do stories on probably 2 or 3 times the number of people who I ultimately did report on. So why was I selective? Despite being in these, this hallowed area of the National Whistleblower Center, the truth is, as Rich alluded to, whistleblowers can be really difficult people. They can be a huge pain in the neck. And I'm not saying that lightly. There are a lot of reasons why that enter into the calculation of whether you could or should go ahead with a story. First of all, they all have, by their very nature, an axe to grind. They're trying to get their own story out. Many of them have an inflated sense of what they want to break or their own value to the organizations that they're now reporting on. So today I thought I'd talk about kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of whistleblowers and end with a couple of war stories. Whistleblowers are not truly sources per se. Generally, they are people who've worked inside a government agency or a corporation, and they're desperate to tell their stories and go on the record, on camera in my case, to often defy their bosses, disappoint, and in some cases even betray their colleagues to tell the world about some alleged wrongdoing. I obviously appreciate what they do and the risks that they take, and I'm proud of the stories that I've worked on regarding them. But as a journalist, it's often a very difficult process. Rich and John and I were talking before we got here, and Rich made a good point, which is that when you first approach a whistleblower, you end up spending almost all your time trying to discredit and disprove what this person is bringing to you. And that's for the ultimate purpose of then, if you believe in them and they're credible, of then trying to prove and push out their story. But you need to spend that time up front in trying to almost knock down, almost in the way that a lawyer would in a deposition, what they're about to say, because you have to anticipate that that's what is going to happen on the back end once you do the reporting. So you need to be very conscious going in about the negative aspects of their story. But just on personalities for a second, and this is not entirely a trivial concern, but whistleblowers, as I said, are often difficult people. First of all, generally when I would meet them, they feel persecuted, hated, or ignored by their own organization, and there's a certain therapy element to dealing with them. And I'm sure Steve can talk about that because he has to deal with them day after day, sometimes for years. They're often not used to feeling like outcasts in their own organizations, and the pressure on them can be really intense. Some of them start to imagine conspiracies and threats, and it leads to often a difficult situation up front. In addition, many of these folks often are kind of perfectionists by nature, and in my experience, some of them almost obsessively follow the rules, and then they're just so disappointed when people around them don't treat the rules in the same fashion. So it's the job of the reporter to determine how big of a deal their grievances are, because in some cases they might be petty. They may be right. Someone may have violated a rule, but it may not be that consequential. So that's part of the process of ferreting out whether you want to move forward. Secondly, as I mentioned, you have to deal with the issue of possible skeletons in the closet. So you can anticipate that an organization, in Rich's case, a White House, is going to push back and push back hard. And they're going to look for any negative thing that they can find to discredit that whistleblower. And they have all the resources imaginable because they have the employee records. In many cases, a corporation or an organization or a government agency is not supposed to reveal that information. A lot of times it's covered under the Privacy Act. But trust me, they will manage to find a way to get the information out. It may not be done overtly, but the information will get out. And consequently, you've got to start and do this forensic work on your own almost immediately as you begin hearing the story. It's just so important up front. You don't want to be surprised later to learn about something that may not even really be connected to the main issue. But for instance, if there's an old lawsuit or a bankruptcy or something that's embarrassing, it may have a bearing on what you're reporting. And to some degree, you are taking on, by airing their story or doing a report, to some degree, you're taking on their own account. You are kind of owning it. And you have to be comfortable with that and all the aspects of a person's background and personality. Finally, kind of the three big buckets here, big picture items. There's the not so little issue of the truth. Whistleblowers, their stories need to be evaluated carefully, obviously, because just think about it. Their jobs are on the line, their reputations, and they also have, in many cases, have a possible financial gain at stake. And I'm hoping that Steve will talk about that in the litigation. I wasn't really ever aware of that. I wouldn't really pursue that, but I had to be mindful that there was some financial benefit for these people coming forward. And all that means is, in the same way any reporter always has to assess the credibility of a source or person they're interviewing, you just have to be that much more on guard for all of those reasons. The other issue that is just kind of intrinsic with all this is that oftentimes the alleged bad behavior that the whistleblower is talking about has taken place behind closed doors. And I mean, obviously there might be an audit trail, there might be documents, but many times they're talking about information that maybe only one or two other people know about. And that just creates a situation where you need to be doubly, triply cognizant of this and just try to do a better, even better job in reporting. So those are kind of some of the pitfalls, if you will, of dealing with whistleblowers. Now, just for the good part, I guess. As Rich has said, I consider whistleblowers, many of them, to be real heroes, in some cases patriots, who help expose evil and wrongdoing in our country. And I'm thinking of, with 60 Minutes, Dick Clark, Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco case, Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, and so many more. In my own career, I haven't had any of those big ticket items, but I have worked on some stories that I still think are important. Steve mentioned Bunny Greenhouse. Those of you who don't know Bunny, she was a procurement official in the Pentagon who came to NBC News, and I worked primarily with Lisa Myers at NBC, and told us that her colleagues, other federal contracting officials, had bent the rules regarding handing out contracts to Halliburton. And wow, I don't know if you remember, Bunny was so nervous during that interview. Our first tape, we rolled a 20-minute beta tape. We never used one sentence from it. She just was so nervous, and she had never been in this position before of, essentially talking out of school regarding what had happened with her former employers. But she warmed up and she did a great interview. But she suffered as a result. It was very, very hard for her. Another former government employee we interviewed is a woman named Jane Turner. Jane was an FBI agent. She came to us and told us that during the cleanup at 9/11 at Ground Zero, FBI agents had repeatedly removed rubble and artifacts that they then handed out as souvenirs to their friends and family. On its face, it doesn't sound like that terrible of a crime, but we went and talked to 9/11 families, and they were just so stunned. They consider Ground Zero, really to be a grave site, and they were horrified by this behavior. Jane pointed it out, and she was vilified within the FBI. They came up against her very hard and really tried to smear her despite a really good track record as an employee. A federal court ultimately rewarded her with $1.4 million for the retaliation that she suffered and also back pay. And finally, we interviewed Bassem Youssef, who was and is, I guess still probably today, the highest-ranking Arab-American FBI agent. Bassem also had never done an interview, and he went on camera to tell us that in his estimation, the FBI was very, very poorly educated about radical Islam. And this is someone who had worked on, prior to 9/11, all the major terrorism cases and was really considered an expert. After 9/11, for a variety of reasons, he wasn't used in that capacity. And in the interview, he said that the FBI wasn't doing everything that it could do to combat terrorism, and that when it was involved, and obviously the FBI is involved, it was doing it in a kind of haphazard and ignorant fashion. And then he also talked about how he personally had been discriminated against after 9/11. And I just want to read, as part of this story, Steve was allowed to depose a number of senior FBI officials. We ended up doing this story using the interview with Bassem, but as a kind of side benefit to doing this story, we were given access to videotape depositions of senior FBI officials talking about their knowledge of terrorism. And Steve was able to depose Dale Watson, who was the top FBI counterterrorism official both before and then after 9/11. And I've known Dale for years and always held him in high regard as a counterterrorism official. But I'll just read you this exchange because it sure surprised me. Steve asked, quote, "Do you know who Osama bin Laden's spiritual advisor was?" Dale Watson: "Can't recall." Steve: "And do you know the differences in the religion between Shiite and Sunni Muslims?" "Not technically, no." So again, this is not the Pentagon Papers or even a case like Rich and taking on the White House, but I thought it was important. And our access to this whistleblower gave us access to these videotapes and shed some light on what was going on in the FBI at a critical moment. And none of this could have been revealed without a courageous whistleblower. So just in closing, I want to say, just to wrap up, I guess, they can be very difficult, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort that you have to put into it because they can produce some of the most meaningful stories, and they're good for our democracy.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say one thing. I very much appreciate Jim's remarks because for the whistleblowers who are listening to this and who will be listening to this, it's extremely important to understand, how the press views you, what you need to do in order to have a credible presentation. And I think Jim's very, very straightforward analysis of that is really helpful, and I really take my hat off and thank you for those words.